Catherine the Great, Portrait of a Woman, by Robert K. Massie. Introduction. Imagine for a moment that you are 14 years old. You're from a small, unimportant town, part of a family with a good name but very little money. Your mother sees you not as a daughter to be loved, but as a chess piece to be moved in the great game of European royalty. One cold winter day, a letter arrives. It's a summons. You are to leave everything you have ever known, your home, your language, your faith, and travel 1,000 miles to a vast, frozen, and foreign empire. Your mission? To marry a boy you barely know, a boy who is the heir to that empire. A boy who is strange, childish, and sickly. You arrive, a stranger in a strange land, and you are brought before the most powerful woman in that empire, the Empress. She is dazzling, covered in diamonds, radiating an authority you can barely comprehend. And she looks at you, this 14-year-old girl, and in her eyes, you see your entire future hanging in the balance. She expects you to please her, to please the nation, and, most importantly, to produce an heir to secure the dynasty. What would you do? How would you survive? Would you be crushed by the loneliness, the intrigue, the immense pressure, or would you find a way not just to survive, but to conquer? This is not a fairy tale. It is the true story of a young German princess named Sophia, who would one day become Catherine the Great. In his magnificent biography, Catherine the Great, Portrait of a Woman, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author Robert K. Massie doesn't just give us a history lesson. He takes us on an intimate journey into the mind and heart of one of the most remarkable women who ever lived. He shows us how a neglected child, armed with little more than intelligence and an unshakable will, transformed herself into a titan of history. This is more than the story of an empress. It's a masterclass in resilience, in the art of turning weakness into strength, and in the sheer, unstoppable power of ambition. By the time we are done today, you will understand not just how Catherine built an empire, but how she built herself. And you will discover the timeless lessons hidden in her life, lessons about power, about love, and about what it truly means to shape your own destiny. Book summary. Our story begins not in the glittering palaces of Russia, but in the dreary, windswept town of Stettin, a provincial port on the Baltic coast of Germany. There, a young girl named Sophia Augusta Frederica was born in 1729. Her father, Prince Christian Augustus, was a good but unremarkable man, a disciplined, pious, and deeply boring career soldier in the Prussian army. Her mother, Joanna Elizabeth, was the opposite. She was beautiful, vivacious, and consumed by an ambition that her life had utterly failed to satisfy. Married at 15 to a man more than twice her age, Joanna felt trapped. She had dreamed of a life at the center of Europe's great courts, but she found herself stuck in a provincial town with a puritanical husband and a tiny income. She was certain she deserved something better. And when, after 18 months of marriage, she gave birth, she poured all her frustrated ambitions into the child. She dreamed of a son, a handsome, brilliant boy whose future she could guide, a boy who would be her ticket out of obscurity. But the baby was a girl. A daughter. Sophia. From the very beginning, Joanna could not find it in her heart to love this child. The birth nearly cost Joanna her life, but the deeper reason for her rejection was simple and cruel. Sophia was not the son she had so desperately wanted. She handed the baby over to servants and wet nurses, offering no maternal affection, no warmth, no comfort. Sophia later wrote in her memoirs, "I was merely tolerated and often I was scolded with a violence and anger I did not deserve." 18 months later, Johanna finally had the son she craved, a boy named Wilhelm. He was a sickly child, possibly suffering from rickets, and Joanna became obsessed with him. She lavished on this little boy all the affection she had denied her daughter. Sophia, already keenly aware that her own birth had been a disappointment, now had to watch as her mother showered her brother with kisses, tender caresses, and whispered endearments. This rejection left a permanent wound. For the rest of her life, even at the height of her power as Empress of Russia, Catherine would be searching for the elemental warmth and love that her mother had given so freely to her brother, but never to her. It teaches us something profound about human nature. Even the most powerful people on earth are often driven by the simple, unmet needs of their childhood. To avoid more hurt, young Sophia learned to seal off her emotions. She became a keen observer of the world around her, a skill that would serve her well. But her childhood wasn't entirely cold. She found a source of warmth and wisdom in her governess, a French Huguenot woman named Elizabeth Cardell, whom Sophia called Babet. Babet understood that the little girl's frequent defiance came from a deep-seated loneliness and a craving for encouragement. Babet gave her that, and something more, a lifelong love for the French language and for learning. She taught Sophia to read Corneille, Racine, and Molière. This was in stark contrast to her religion tutor, a pedantic army chaplain who tried to teach by rote memorization. Sophia, already an independent thinker, drove him to distraction with questions he couldn't answer. Why were great men of antiquity damned simply because they hadn't known of Christ? What was the universe like before creation? The tutor would shout that these were matters of faith, not reason, and even threatened her with his cane. From this, Sophia learned another lesson she would carry for life. All my life I have had this inclination to yield only to gentleness and reason, and to resist all pressure. Her mother, Joanna, saw this independent spirit as arrogance and was determined to drive the devil of pride out of her. She repeatedly told Sophia she was ugly and impertinent. Sophia was made to kneel and kiss the hem of the skirts of visiting ladies of rank. She learned to obey, to remain silent, and to conceal her true thoughts behind a cloak of meekness and deference. This ability to hide her pride and humility would later become one of her most powerful political tools, a tactic for survival in a world of danger. Despite her mother's criticism, Sophia's appearance began to improve. By 13, she was slender, with silky, dark chestnut hair, a high forehead, and brilliant dark blue eyes. She was intelligent, witty, and possessed a natural charm. She was discovering how to make people like her. It wasn't about being seductive, it was about making people feel understood. She learned that people prefer to talk rather than listen, and to talk about themselves more than anything else. Her own mother, pathetically anxious to be seen as important, provided a perfect example of how not to behave. Sophia's one overriding desire was to escape her mother. And in the 18th century, for a minor princess, there was only one path of escape: marriage. Not just any marriage, but one that would raise her in rank as far as possible above Joanna. When Sophia was 10, her travels with her mother brought her to the court of her uncle. There she met an 11-year-old boy named Charles Peter Ulrich. He was a strange, sickly child, emotionally underdeveloped, but he was also extraordinarily well-connected. He was the only living grandson of Peter the Great of Russia, and he was also in line to inherit the throne of Sweden. He was, in fact, Sophia's second cousin. Johanna's heart soared as she watched her 10-year-old daughter talking to this boy with such an exalted future. Sophia knew exactly what her mother and aunts were whispering about. And she didn't mind. I knew that one day he would become King of Sweden, she later wrote, and although I was still a child, the title of Queen fell sweetly on my ears. From that moment on, she began to think of herself as destined to be his wife. Then, on New Year's Day, 1744, when Sophia was 14, a courier arrived with a sealed letter for Joanna. It was from Russia. The message was breathtaking. The Empress of Russia, Elizabeth, desired Joanna and her eldest daughter, Sophia, to come to Russia as soon as possible. Another letter, arriving hours later from King Frederick II of Prussia, made the purpose clear. A match was to be arranged between Sophia and her cousin, the boy she had met years before, who was now Grand Duke Peter, the heir to the Russian throne. For Joanna, it was the moment she had been dreaming of for her entire life. After 15 years of a depressing marriage, she was being summoned to the world stage. Her stolid husband, Christian Augustus, was explicitly excluded from the invitation, a deep humiliation for him. He was also tormented by the requirement that his daughter would have to abandon her Lutheran faith and convert to Russian Orthodoxy. But in the end, he had no choice but to consent. While Joanna celebrated her triumph, Sophia was almost ignored. The money for the journey went to her mother's wardrobe. Sophia was left with 3 old dresses and a dozen chemises. But she was just as eager as her mother. This was the escape she had dreamed of. This was the beginning of her climb toward a higher destiny. As her carriage rolled out of the gates of Zerbst, heading for Berlin and then the vast unknown of Russia, Sophia never looked back. And in the more than 50 years of life that lay ahead of her, she never returned. The journey was brutal. It was the dead of winter, and they traveled in a heavy carriage, lurching over frozen ruts in the road. Freezing wind whistled through the cracks. Sophia's feet were often so numb she had to be carried from the carriage when they stopped. But for her, it was all part of a great adventure. She wrote to her father, "In these last days I had a little indigestion because I had drunk all the beer I could find. Dear Mama has put a stop to that and I am well again." Finally, on February 9, 1744, after a journey of nearly a month, their sledge cavalcade arrived at the Golovin Palace in Moscow. The courtyard was lit by flaring torches. The journey was over. Now, a 14-year-old girl, renamed Catherine, would stand before the 2 people who would dominate the next 18 years of her life, the Empress Elizabeth and the Grand Duke Peter. The woman who stood before them was dazzling. Empress Elizabeth, the daughter of Peter the Great, was tall, with a full figure, brilliant blue eyes, and a clear rosy complexion. She was dressed in an immense silver gown trimmed with gold lace, and she was covered in diamonds. Catherine later wrote, "It was quite impossible on seeing her for the first time not to be astonished by her beauty and the majesty of her bearing. In this woman, radiating power and covered in jewels, Catherine saw the embodiment of everything she hoped one day to become." And then there was Peter. He greeted them warmly, speaking German, seeming genuinely happy to see a cousin from his homeland. But the boy Catherine had met 5 years before had not changed much. Now 16, he was still short and thin, with a pale face, a wide mouth, and a sharply receding chin. He was childish, fidgety, and talked incessantly. In their first private conversation, he confessed to Catherine that he wasn't really in love with her. He was in love with one of his aunt's ladies-in-waiting, but the Empress wouldn't permit the marriage. He was marrying Catherine, he explained, simply because his aunt wished it. Catherine was only 14, but she was already wise. If she was wounded by his insensitivity, she didn't show it. She had learned to deal with a lack of love in her own family, and she was prepared to deal with it now. She understood 2 things very quickly. First, that it was the Empress Elizabeth, not Peter, whom she had to please. And second, that to succeed in this new country, she had to become Russian. She threw herself into learning the language and the doctrines of the Orthodox Church. While Peter openly disdained everything Russian, Catherine was an eager and brilliant student. Her dedication nearly killed her. She would rise at night, walking barefoot on the cold stone floors, memorizing Russian words. She caught a cold that turned into acute pneumonia. For 4 weeks, her life hung in the balance. The Empress herself rushed to her bedside, dismissed Catherine's protesting mother, and nursed the young girl. Catherine was bled 16 times in 27 days. As she drifted in and out of consciousness, she would wake to find herself in Elizabeth's arms. During those weeks of suffering, something remarkable happened. The story spread through the court and the city. The little foreign princess loved Russia so much that she had nearly died trying to learn its language. When her mother suggested bringing a Lutheran pastor to her bedside, Catherine, barely able to speak, whispered, "Why do that? Call Simon Todorsky instead," referring to her Orthodox tutor. When the Empress heard this, she burst into tears. In that moment, Catherine, whether by instinct or a flash of genius, won the heart of her new country. She was no longer just a German princess, she was becoming a Russian. After her recovery, her conversion to Orthodoxy and her betrothal to Peter followed. On June 28, 1744, Sophia Augusta Frederica of Anhalt-Zerbst was received into the Russian Orthodox Church and given a new name, Ekaterina, or Catherine. The next day, in the magnificent Assumption Cathedral in the Moscow Kremlin, she and Peter exchanged rings. She was now Her Imperial Highness, a Grand Duchess of Russia. But her marriage, which finally took place in August 1745, was a painful sham. On their wedding night, Catherine waited alone in the enormous marital bed for 2 hours. When Peter finally arrived, reeking of alcohol, he said, "How it would amuse my servants to see us in bed together," then promptly fell asleep. He never touched her. And, as Catherine wrote in her memoirs, matters remained in this state without the slightest change during the following 9 years. Those 9 years were a period of profound loneliness and humiliation. Peter ignored her, preferring to play with his toy soldiers, drill his servants, or pursue fleeting infatuations with Catherine's ladies-in-waiting. Catherine was placed under the watchful eye of a series of governesses, spies who reported her every word and action to the Empress. Her letters were intercepted, her friendships broken. She was, for all intents and purposes, a royal prisoner. But Catherine was not one to be broken by despair. She turned her prison into a university. She had always been intelligent, but now she became deeply learned. With nothing else to do, she began to read. And read. And read. She devoured every book she could find. She read novels and histories, but she also dove into the great works of the Enlightenment. She read Montesquieu's The Spirit of Laws, a profound analysis of government that would shape her own political philosophy. She read the Annals of Tacitus, the Roman historian, and saw in the intrigue and corruption of the Roman Empire parallels to the court around her. And most of all, she read Voltaire. The French philosopher's wit, his clarity, and his call for a government guided by reason became the foundation of her worldview. While Peter played with dolls and toy soldiers, Catherine was forging her mind into a weapon. She was preparing herself for a future she felt was her destiny, even if she didn't know how she would get there. She wrote, "In my inmost soul there was something that never for a single moment allowed me to doubt that, sooner or later, I would become the sovereign Empress of Russia in my own right." The court, and Empress Elizabeth, had one overwhelming concern: the lack of an heir. After 7 years of this unconsummated marriage, Elizabeth's patience ran out. It became clear that if an heir was to be produced, it would not be by Peter. The Empress's chief governess, a woman named Maria Choglakova, took Catherine aside and delivered an astonishing proposition. She told Catherine that for the good of the state, an exception to the rules of marriage must be made. Catherine, she said, must choose a lover. I leave you to choose between Sergei Saltykov and Lev Narishkin, the governess said. Catherine chose Sergei Saltykov. He was handsome, charming, and a notorious womanizer. He was, as Catherine described him, handsome as the dawn. Their affair began in the summer of 1752. It was a dangerous game, but one seemingly sanctioned by the highest powers in the empire. In May 1753, Catherine became pregnant, but suffered a miscarriage. She became pregnant again. On September 20, 1754, after 9 years of marriage, Catherine gave birth to a son, Paul. But her brief moment of triumph turned instantly to sorrow. Just as she had been taken from her own mother at birth, her child was now taken from her. As soon as the baby was bathed, Empress Elizabeth swept into the room, took the infant, and had him carried away to her own apartments. Catherine was left alone, weak and bleeding, on a mattress on the floor. She was not allowed to see her son, not allowed to hold him, not even allowed to ask about him, for that would imply a lack of trust in the Empress's care. The pain of this separation was compounded by another betrayal. Saltykov, having achieved his goal and fathered the heir to the throne, grew bored. He was sent away on a diplomatic mission and never returned to her. Catherine was once again alone, without her child and without her lover. She did not crumble. Instead, she found a new love, this time with a young, romantic, and sophisticated Polish nobleman named Stanislaus Poniatowski. He was different from Saltykov. He was devoted, gentle, and he admired Catherine's mind as much as her beauty. For a time, she found a measure of happiness with him. In 1757, she gave birth to a daughter, Anna, who was almost certainly Poniatowski's child. But tragedy struck again. The little girl was frail and died after only 15 months. As the years passed, Empress Elizabeth's health began to fail. The court buzzed with intrigue about the succession. Everyone knew Peter was unfit to rule. He was openly pro-Prussian, a fervent admirer of Russia's enemy, King Frederick the Great. He despised the Russian army, the Russian church, and the Russian people. Catherine, on the other hand, had become thoroughly Russian. She was intelligent, competent, and deeply patriotic. A conspiracy began to form around her. The leaders were a band of 5 brothers, officers in the Imperial Guard, the Orloffs. The most prominent was Gregory Orloff, a hero of the war against Prussia. He was tall, handsome, brave, and reckless. He fell passionately in love with Catherine, and she with him. He and his brothers saw in her the only hope for Russia's future. They were joined by others, including Nikita Panin, the astute tutor of Catherine's son, Paul. On Christmas Day, 1761, Empress Elizabeth died. Peter III became Emperor of Russia. His reign lasted only 6 months. It was a whirlwind of folly and disaster. He immediately ended the war with Prussia, giving back to Frederick all the territory Russia had won at great cost in blood and treasure. He tried to force the Russian army into tight-fitting Prussian uniforms and make them practice Prussian drill. He insulted the Orthodox Church, calling its priests bearded goats. He alienated everyone. And he continued to humiliate Catherine. He openly flaunted his mistress, a coarse, ugly woman named Elizabeth Vorontsova, and spoke of divorcing Catherine, locking her in a convent, and marrying his new love. The final insult came at a state banquet. In front of 400 guests, Peter, drunk, grew angry with Catherine for some minor breach of protocol. He sent an adjutant to her, and then, fearing his message wasn't being delivered with enough force, he stood up and screamed a single word across the hall: "Dura? Fool?" Catherine burst into tears. That night, Peter ordered her arrest. The order was rescinded only after the intervention of his uncle. But Catherine knew her life was in danger. She later wrote, "It was then that I began to listen to the proposals to depose Peter." The moment came on the night of June 28, 1762. A conspirator had been arrested, and the Orloffs knew they had to act immediately. Gregory's brother, the giant, scar-faced Alexis Orloff, galloped through the night to Peterhof, where Catherine was staying. He woke her at dawn. "The time has come," he whispered. "You must come with me. Everything is ready for your proclamation." Catherine, wearing a simple black dress, rode with him back to St. Petersburg. At the barracks of the Izmailovsky Guards, Soldiers rushed out to greet her, kissing her hands and the hem of her dress, swearing allegiance to her as their empress. Regiment after regiment joined her. She rode to the Kazan Cathedral, where the archbishop proclaimed her the sovereign autocrat, Catherine II. Then, at the Winter Palace, she stood on the balcony, holding her 8-year-old son Paul by the hand, and presented him to the cheering crowds as her heir. But Peter was still at large. Catherine, understanding that the coup was not complete until her husband was dealt with, made another dramatic decision. She would lead the troops herself. Dressed in the green uniform of an officer of the Preobrazhensky Guards, she mounted a white stallion and, at the head of 14,000 men, marched on Peterhof. Peter, hearing of the coup, was paralyzed with fear and indecision. He fled from Peterhof to his estate at Oranienbaum. He wrote Catherine a pathetic letter, offering to share the throne with her. She refused. He wrote another, offering to abdicate if he could retire to his German homeland of Holstein with his mistress. Catherine accepted his abdication, but she knew she could not let him go. A living, deposed emperor, especially one with ties to Prussia, would be a permanent rallying point for her enemies. Peter was taken to a remote country estate called Ropsha, under the guard of Alexis Orlov and a detachment of soldiers. Catherine was now the sole ruler of Russia. But a dark shadow was about to fall over her victory. A week later, a frantic, almost illegible note arrived from Alexis Orlov. "Matushka, little mother," it began, "how can I explain what happened? He is no more." But no one intended it so. At dinner, he started quarreling. Before we could separate them, he was dead. We ourselves know not what we did. Peter III was dead, strangled in a drunken brawl with his guards. Whether it was a premeditated murder or an accident will never be known. Catherine was almost certainly innocent of any direct involvement, but she had placed her husband in the hands of men who hated him. She knew the world would hold her responsible. She had his body examined, and the official cause of death was announced as an apoplectic stroke brought on by hemorrhoidal colic. Few believed it. Frederick the Great quipped, he allowed himself to be dethroned like a child being sent to bed. The shadow of her husband's death would follow Catherine for the rest of her life. But she did not flinch. The dream of the little girl from Stettin was now a reality. At 33 years old, she sat alone on the throne of Peter the Great. Half of her life, and her entire reign, lay before her. Once on the throne, Catherine proved to be a master politician. She knew she was a usurper, a German woman with no hereditary right to rule Russia. Her claim rested solely on the will of the people who had put her there, the army, the church, and the nobility. She began by rewarding them lavishly. The Orlov brothers were made counts and showered with money and estates. She brought back from exile the old chancellor, Alexis Bestujev, who had been the first to see her potential. And she was magnanimous to her former enemies, including Peter's mistress, whom she quietly pensioned off. She understood the religious and political power of a coronation. In a magnificent ceremony in the ancient capital of Moscow, she placed the imperial crown on her own head, solidifying her claim to the throne in the eyes of the nation. But Catherine was more than a shrewd politician, she was a true student of the Enlightenment. She had spent her lonely years as a Grand Duchess educating herself, and now she intended to put those ideas into practice. She began a famous correspondence with Voltaire, declaring herself his disciple. She bought the library of the great French philosopher Denis Diderot to save him from financial ruin, and then invited him to St. Petersburg for a series of long, informal conversations. She told him, "You work only on paper which accepts anything. While I, poor empress, work on human skin, which is far more sensitive and touchy." Her most ambitious project was the nakas, or instruction, a set of guiding principles for a new, modern legal code for Russia. Drawing heavily on Montesquieu and the Italian jurist Beccaria, she called for equality before the law, condemned the use of torture, and argued for religious tolerance. It was a revolutionary document for its time. To discuss it, she summoned a legislative commission, an assembly of delegates from all free classes of the empire. It was the first attempt in Russia to give the people a voice in their own destiny. But Catherine's liberal ideals collided with the harsh realities of Russia. When the discussion turned to serfdom, the institution that held millions of peasants in bondage, the nobility rose up in fierce opposition. Catherine, who personally abhorred serfdom, realized she could not move against the class on whose support her throne depended. The Legislative Commission was eventually dissolved, and no new code of laws was written. This was a bitter lesson, but it was soon overshadowed by a far more violent one. In 1773, a massive rebellion exploded in the southeastern provinces, led by a Don Cossack named Emelian Pugachev. Pugachev claimed to be the miraculously saved Peter III, returned to free the serfs and punish the nobility. His rebellion became a maelstrom of terror and bloodshed. Landlords were tortured and killed, their mansions burned. For over a year, Pugachev's army of Cossacks, runaway serfs, and tribal peoples swept across the land, at one point threatening Moscow itself. Catherine, at first dismissive of the Marquis de Pugachev, soon realized she was facing a full-scale civil war. She was forced to recall her best generals from the war she was fighting with Turkey. The rebellion was finally crushed with immense brutality on both sides. Pugachev was captured, brought to Moscow in an iron cage, and executed. The experience hardened Catherine. She saw the raw, violent passions that lay just beneath the surface of her empire. There would be no more talk of freeing the serfs. The security of the state, she concluded, must come first. While she wrestled with these internal crises, she pursued a brilliant and aggressive foreign policy. She saw Russia's destiny in the south, toward the Black Sea, which was controlled by the Ottoman Empire. In 2 successful wars against the Turks, her armies, led by legendary generals like Suvorov, and her newly created Black Sea Fleet, won stunning victories. She annexed the Crimean Peninsula, a land of ancient Greek history and breathtaking beauty. And at the center of this whirlwind of war, diplomacy, and nation-building was one towering figure, Grigory Potemkin. For 17 years, he was the most powerful man in Russia. He was Catherine's lover, her chief advisor, her commander-in-chief, and, quite possibly, her secret husband. Their relationship was one of the great love stories of the 18th century, a passionate, turbulent partnership of 2 brilliant, powerful, and deeply complex individuals. He was 10 years younger than she, a man of ferocious energy, boundless ambition, and eccentric genius. He was moody, extravagant, and often difficult, but he shared Catherine's grand vision for Russia. Together, they transformed the South. Potemkin built new cities like Kherson and Sebastopol, created a powerful Black Sea Fleet, and encouraged the settlement of the vast, empty steppes. It was he who orchestrated Catherine's legendary journey to the Crimea in 1787, a spectacular display of Russia's newfound power that both dazzled and alarmed Europe. The myth of Potemkin villages, fake, painted facades to deceive the Empress, was a slander invented by his enemies. The cities and the fleet he built were very real, as the Turks would discover. Their physical passion eventually faded, but their bond of affection and political partnership remained unbroken until his death. After their romantic separation, Catherine took a series of younger lovers, or favorites. These were usually handsome young guards officers, whom she showered with wealth and titles. For Catherine, now growing older, these relationships were a search for companionship, for warmth, and for the illusion of youth. She needed to love and be loved. But none of them could ever replace Potemkin. As she entered the twilight of her reign, she was the preeminent monarch in Europe. But new shadows were falling. The French Revolution erupted in 1789, and Catherine, once the friend of the philosophes, was horrified by the execution of Louis XVI and the Reign of Terror. She saw the revolution as a French poison that threatened every throne in Europe. In Poland, she saw a reflection of this revolutionary fire. Fearing a strong, independent Poland on her border, she intervened, and in 2 further partitions with Prussia and Austria, the Polish state was completely erased from the map. Her final years were focused on her grandchildren, especially her beloved Alexander. She adored him and supervised his education, hoping to mold him into the ideal enlightened monarch she had once aspired to be. She grew so disillusioned with her own son, the difficult and erratic Paul, that she seriously considered disinheriting him and passing the throne directly to Alexander. But she never made the final move. On the morning of November 5, 1796, Catherine, now 67, rose at her usual hour, drank her coffee, and sat down to work. A short while later, she went into her dressing room and collapsed from a massive stroke. She never regained consciousness. She died the following evening, after a reign of 34 years. Her son, Paul, finally became emperor. One of his first acts was to have the remains of his supposed father, Peter III, exhumed. In a grim ceremony, Peter's coffin was placed beside Catherine's for a joint lying in state, a final, macabre act of reproach from a son who had never forgiven his mother for the throne she had taken and the father he had lost. Commentary. So, what do we take away from this incredible life? Robert Massie's biography shows us that Catherine's story is not just a tale of power and conquest. It's a profound lesson in the art of becoming. She arrived in Russia as a piece of property, a young girl whose only value was her potential to produce an heir. She had no power, no allies, and no love. And yet, from that position of absolute weakness, she rose to become one of the most powerful rulers in the world. How did she do it? This is the central question the book helps us answer, and it holds a powerful lesson for anyone feeling like an outsider, for anyone who feels that the circumstances of their life are holding them back. First, Catherine mastered the art of turning adversity into advantage. Those 9 years of her empty, humiliating marriage could have broken her. Instead, she used that time of isolation to forge the single greatest weapon she would ever possess, her mind. She read relentlessly. She studied history, philosophy, and law. She learned about the country she was in, its people, its customs, its power structures. While her husband was lost in childish fantasies, she was preparing. This is a lesson that echoes through the lives of so many great figures. The moments that feel like a prison, the times when we feel most stuck and powerless, can become our greatest opportunities for growth, if we choose to make them so. Your time in exile? Whether that's a boring job, a difficult situation at home, or just a period of uncertainty in your life, is never wasted if you use it to learn. Second, Catherine understood the psychology of power. She learned early on to please those who held authority over her, Empress Elizabeth, the Russian court, the military, but she did it without ever losing sight of her own ambition. She learned to be patient. She waited 18 years for her moment, never acting rashly, always observing, planning, and building alliances. Her coup was not a sudden impulse, it was the culmination of years of quiet, careful work. It teaches us that true power isn't always about being the loudest person in the room. Sometimes, it's about being the most observant, the most patient, and the most prepared. And finally, Catherine's story is a testament to the power of a clear and unwavering ambition. She wrote in her memoirs that from a young age, she never doubted she would one day rule Russia in her own right. This wasn't just arrogance, it was a deep, internal conviction that served as her North Star through all the years of darkness. It guided her decisions, fueled her resilience, and gave her the courage to seize her destiny when the moment came. Having a vision for your life that is so clear and so powerful that it pulls you through every obstacle is perhaps the greatest asset you can possess. Of course, Catherine was not a saint. She was a flawed human being. She was ruthless when she needed to be. She was a party to the dismemberment of Poland. She talked of freeing the serfs but ultimately strengthened the system that bound them. She was an absolute autocrat who loved the language of liberty. Massie's book doesn't shy away from these contradictions. It presents her in all her complexity, as a woman of vast intellect and ambition, but also of great passion and deep loneliness. She was a ruler who expanded an empire, but also a woman who, at the end of a long day, just wanted someone to talk to, someone to make her laugh. That was the book summary of Catherine the Great, Portrait of a Woman, by Robert K. Massie. We've touched on the grand sweep of her life today, but a summary is like looking at a map of a great country. The real adventure, the real understanding, comes when you travel through the landscape yourself. The magic of this book is in the details, the quiet moments, the personal letters, the vivid descriptions of a world that is both magnificent and brutal. This summary is designed to help you decide if this journey is one you want to take. If anything we've talked about today has sparked your curiosity, I urge you to grab a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning history, it's an experience that can genuinely change how you think about ambition, power, and the incredible capacity of the human will. A link to the book is in the description below. Also, if you found this summary valuable, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It tells us that these journeys into the lives of great figures are worth taking, and it ensures you won't miss our next exploration into another life-changing book from the billionaire's bookshelf. Let's keep learning and growing together.